DNS debate, super important, somewhat important, not important. Republican opposition to the bill, super important, somewhat important, all right, not important. Heritage opposition to the bill, super important, interesting, somewhat important. Okay. For those of you who thought the Republican opposition was very important, but the heritage opposition was less important, any insight, comment? Why? Anybody else? All right. Okay. So this is an outline of the talk. We're going to talk a little bit about the dominant narratives. That'll be me, methodology and findings. We're going to do some SOPA by the numbers, where we're going to look at our data, and I'm going to talk about methodology in a second, but I'll explain what that SOPA by the numbers is. We're then going to do a deeper dive into some key narratives. These are not the only narratives that emerged from this big set of interviews, but there's some of the ones that have been left untold, and some of the ones that required some really sophisticated digging to kind of unpack. And then we're going to talk about maybe some of the future research questions. Our participants have been invited, our commentators have been invited to jump in wherever they want. We are not saving them to the end. Their modest introductions don't really belie the level of sophistication that they have on this particular policy debate. And for Jonathan, the context he has for this particular policy debate, because he's been involved in this issue since before the DMCA. Can I say
Meaning
that?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, in other words, I'm a really old guy.
Yeah, well, I was there too. So I've invited them to jump in as they see fit. So the dominant narratives on the SOPA project, on SOPA, right? The internet was having its Howard Beale moment. That was one of my favorites, right? Users were mad as hell and they weren't going to take it anymore. So this was a populist uprising fueled very much by social media. Folks like Mike Masnick and others were putting out good content. People got active on Reddit and other Red State and other sorts of things, and played into, whoa, something just happened on my computer. It didn't happen on their computer. So that's one dominant narrative. Yeah, Richmond, help me. I don't know what just happened.
I don't even know.
Is that the thing where you have like the...
I'm sorry, like,
That's okay.
it just...
It's not.
So the other narrative, if we went to the next screen, would basically be the narrative that Google and Wikimedia hijack the eyeballs of their users, that they overuse their dominant position in the communications ecosystem, thank you, to basically create astroturf, if you will, right? That yes, there was concern, but they were overusing their place in the ecosystem. So as relatively sophisticated observers, I think, of this process, even though I was sitting on the West Coast, I said, wow, this narrative seems really incomplete. Clearly, there is a lot of grassroots activity going on, but clearly the grassroots is also having an impact that often doesn't happen, and so it suggested some connection between inside and outside that hadn't been dealt with. The dominant stories basically pretended as though legislative process didn't exist. And I think most of the people in this room know that legislative process is both can be very important on a bill of this sort. And there was a kind of lack of appreciation of critical dependencies, what we might call but-for events. So an understanding of, even if we think that the blackout, for example, was the critical defining moment, what made space for that critical defining moment, right? What were the points in the process that determined whether or not we ever got there? So why does all of this matter? Why are we unpacking this many years later? Well, one, focusing on what's visible, tweets, mobilization, calls to Congress, doesn't really provide useful insight into the who, what, why, where, and when of events. One of my favorite statements in a report that I've ever read said something like, well, looking at who was talking in the media gives us a good sense of who was lobbying for and against a bill. And And I was like, well, what do you think trade associations are for? They're so people don't actually have to talk, right? So there was a level of sophistication. I was like, that is it. Two, we can't either repeat it or avoid it if we don't actually understand what the magic pixie dust was that made something happen. Ground truths require a lot more digging. You'll see from the narratives here that even those who were intimately engaged in this process have different perspectives on what happened. And sometimes they're competing, and more often I think they're actually complementary, and that, in many instances they're kind of both right. And for someone who cares a lot about technology policy making, I think the story here has a lot to tell us about what are some of the gaps in our policy processes. So a little bit about methodology. We conducted 39 in-depth, semi-structured interviews with key informants. They were identified largely through snowball sampling, so we didn't just kind of randomly stop. We kind of stopped when we had kind of a saturation. People were saying these are the people who really you need to talk to. It's highly diverse. Supporters, opponents, insiders, outside, diverse roles, advocates, lobbyists, government officials, technologists, Congress members, people in the White House, you name it, right? It was a very rich set. We augmented that with the development of a timeline that includes not just public-facing events, kind of the traditional legislative process events, but lots of other events that people viewed as really critical to understanding how SOPA unfolded. And we have a timeline of about 328 activities and events. And we used that with our informants to try to elicit more information about what was going on, right? What was really happening. We then did qualitative analysis of the interviews. So this means PhD students, Leslie, to some extent me, doing a lot of reading and coding of the interviews. And then we did a quantitative analysis of the interviews to develop some high-level findings, and that's where Sebastian came in. There's additional work to continue, but just to give you a sense of what we've done to date. Here's some general stats about the interviews. 29 opponents, 8 proponents, 2 neutral, 27 insiders, 12 outsiders. You'll notice this empty box in the proponent outsiders, and that wasn't a category that anybody gave us anyone to interview in. And that in and of itself is kind of an interesting story, and one that we got some insight in about this morning, which might be worth talking about later. So I'm going to do some SOPA by the numbers. So conflicting narratives emerge from the research. You're familiar with all of these, right? Google was command and control. Another narrative, it was a coalition of tech groups, human rights advocates, partially built out of things like the Fair Use Coalition that had initially come together around the DMCA, but expanding to include entrepreneurs and technologists. And there was an insider story of legislative greed and overreach and a really bungled legislative process, focusing largely on Lamar Smith and his role as chairman. There was a very heavy Republican role in killing the bill for a host of different reasons, some having to do with the DNS issue, some having to do with the primary race coming up in January, so there's a host of different things going on there, and the DNS fight. So all of these emerged as kind of competing narratives about what really happened. There was some unanimity, so here's the one point of complete unanimity. Everyone agreed the bill was going to pass, right? That there was some version of this bill, and this, whether you were insider or outsider, pro or anti, whether you came in and you were a newbie to this issue or you were a seasoned someone like Jonathan Ban, I'm not telling you whether or not we interviewed Jonathan. Everyone expected some version of this bill to pass. Okay. So what was important to the bill's demise? All of these things came out of our qualitative interviews, and I'm going to talk about 3 classes of things. One is what was important. So these could be activities, events, strategies, things that people viewed as really influential in the way in which the process evolved. I'm going to talk about what injured the bill, and these are more kind of moments or events that people viewed as kind of but-for moments. If this hadn't have happened, the story might have been different. Okay, so take them as but-for, that kind of sense of causality. And then the last is this question of when did the bill die? And this is kind of events. Did it die at the markup? Did it die at the blackout? When exactly did you think it was, like, clearly SOPA was off life support? It was no longer viable. Here's a long list of 25 items that people thought was important to the bill's demise. This is not in any particular order. We will share the slides if you can't see all of these. But they range from poor drafting and unworkable bill language to Republican concerns about enforcement, particularly the private right of action in DOJ, a lack of technical knowledge by proponents, by Congress generally, grassroots online opposition, the blackout, information sharing. So there's a whole host of things that surfaced. Here are the top 10 factors across all interviewees combined. Said this particular chart averages, yes?
That's average for all of them,
Right.
all interviewees.
Okay, across all, I don't have my notes, so I may turn to Seb to make sure I'm accurately presenting. I don't want to lie with data. Right, I do not, I'm trying to really use data to tell truth. So, grassroots online opposition, the blackout, constituency contacts to Congress, lobbying by Google and other major firms, unwillingness of content industry, the DNS blocking, information sharing, the human rights and free speech messaging, in-person work by technology advocacy groups, and the breaking the internet messaging. This was the top 10. Nothing all that surprising. Yeah. Seb.
So each interview for all these different variables were ranked from effectively 1 through 5, or they didn't mention it at all. And if it was no mention at all, it was 0. 5 is it's very important to the demise of the bill. 1 is explicitly saying that it's not important.
So this is like intensity.
Yeah, it's an
When you
intensity of thinking that it was important for the demise of the bill.
So, if I could just interject quickly at this point, this with respect to this slide and the previous slide, we see all these factors relating to what's important to the bill's demise. When I saw an advance copy of these slides, I guess was yesterday, I was very much reminded of my recent trip this past summer to the Normandy beaches, the D-Day beaches, where not to trivialize D-Day. I mean, because I think D-Day was probably a little more consequential in world history than SOPA. But I was involved in SOPA and not in D-Day, so. What's interesting, of course, is how when we were visiting the various beaches, is how you have these completely different perspectives of what went on and what was important, and certainly, in hindsight, there's a degree of inevitability. Well, of course, the Allies were going to win, right? Of course, D-Day was going to be successful, and of course they were going to break out from Normandy and defeat Germany, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, it wasn't that obvious to the people on the ground, and then what was important and what was critical, and you look at different pieces of the story, and some of them they really focus on all the training and the logistics and the planning that went on in the UK in the months leading up to D-Day, and others talk about what was specifically going on the specific beaches and so on. So it's the point is, of course, is that you have all these different perspectives, but at the same time, there's no one really knows. And everything is important and nothing's important, and you also have all these views of history, sort of like a butterfly view, and it could be that if one foxhole, one machine gun nest wasn't taken out at a certain time, that could have had a ripple effect, and it really could have had a lot of the same thing with SOPA. So in any event, I just wanted to, to sort of, that was one analogy that really struck me, that it's again, in retrospect, and the same thing with the but-for moments, meaning certainly in retrospect, you can say, this is it, or that's
Right.
it, or whatever, but certainly when you're at the time,
Absolutely
it's
not.
all unknowable, and the truth is it is ultimately unknowable, meaning, you can try to figure out and parse things out, but at the end of the day, it's you know, you end up with all of these different things, and everyone has a different perspective, and no one's right or wrong. I mean, it's just different perspectives.
I think you're a born ethnographer. That's what I'm going to say. You have a position at Berkeley if you want it. All right. So, but what gets interesting is when you start to look at where people stood in relationship to the story and their perspective, because things start to kind of break out in different ways. So this is outsiders opposing SOPA. They will always be in what looks to you to be black, but is actually dark green. And it tells you what they thought was important to the demise, right? And kind of unsurprisingly, the online blackout, the grassroots online opposition, constituency contacts, because some of that grassroots advocacy led to people showing up in Schumer's office, showing up in local members' offices over breaks. They thought that coordination and information sharing by the bill opponents was very important, right? And as I mentioned, the grassroots advocacy ended up being pretty well targeted to have an effect. The human rights and free speech messaging and online activism surrounding the first Judiciary Committee hearing. These were for them kind of the highlights, the things that were really important. Insiders opposing SOPA thought there were some other things that were important. So one, coming in at number 2 here is general Republican opposition due to regulation, right? That the DNS provisions in particular were reviewed as kind of big government regulatory action. Republicans were very concerned about giving Eric Holder, then at DOJ, any more authority. They were very concerned about the whole fast and furious stuff, so there was this general concern among Republicans. And then also the controversy around surrounding DNS blocking makes their list, and it's not on the list of the outsider opponents. Insiders supporting SOPA identified a bunch of different things. For them, unsurprisingly, right, lobbying by Google and other major firms. You will see mismanagement by the bill chair, which isn't mentioned by anyone else. And this is Lamar Smith in particular. And also mismanagement by the bill proponents. And so a sense of kind of overreaching of their own side. So that gives you some sense of what things people thought was important, right? General factors. What I'm going to talk about now is what they viewed as having injured the bill. So again, these are more of the but-for moments. Things that came up, these 7 events, each interview is ranked on a scale of from 0 to 2. So it was unimportant, it was kind of important, or it was really important, similar to the questions I asked you at the beginning. The technologist report was viewed as important. The American, here are things that came out. Technologists, American censorship campaign, the House hearing, House markup, the heritage announcement, the White House opposition, and the online blackout. So this is overall, you can see purple or magenta, I don't know what you guys see when you look at that color, is the insider proponents, so people who were supporting the legislation. The green is insiders who were against, right, who were opponents of the bill. And then the black is outsider opponents of the bill. And you can see that they break out differently, right? So as far as what injured the bill, the online blackout plays a very strong role in the opinion of outsiders against. When you look at the House Judiciary Committee markup, you see that the insider opponents and the insider proponents both view that as relatively more important. And so you can go through, there are some interesting alignments. So like the American censorship campaign, how important it was, varies in some interesting ways. Some things that stand out is that there's general agreement by the opponents and the proponents that the November committee hearing was very injurious. So that was the first day of the online action of the American censorship campaign. Leslie's going to talk more about this. But to put in perspective, there were 90,000 phone calls made that day, and when people used to be fearful of the Christian Coalition, they used to generate, what, 10, right?
I think once it was 30,000.
Once 30, okay, but 90,000 calls was a lot of phone calls.
Right.
Okay. Insider opponents and proponents saw the December markup as injurious. Interestingly, outsiders didn't, and the insider supporters, right, the insider proponents, saw it as much more injurious than other events, that the markup for them was a really key point when they viewed the bill as getting enormously injured. And I'm going to talk about later how much injured they thought it was. Insider opponents saw Heritage's opposition as a very big event. Interestingly, it was barely mentioned by outsider opponents, and given that there was some influence from some
It's
people.
supposed to be proponent.
Oh, the last one is supposed to
Yeah.
say insider
Proponents.
proponents. Sorry,
Yeah,
we
I
thought
thought
we fixed that. So it was barely mentioned by either of those other groups, but the insider opponents viewed it as quite important. By the numbers, when did the bill die? So insiders, 81% thought the bill died before the blackout, right? And so if you assume the dominant narratives, whether it was Google who fueled it or a social media backlash, they all viewed the online blackout as the big seminal moment when the bill died. 81% of insiders, so regardless of where you stood, supporting or opposing the bill, thought that the bill died before the blackout. And that in their words, for example, the blackout, it was about putting the nails in the coffin. It was not about actually killing the bill. Outsiders.
Stomping on the dead kitty.
There was that too, yeah. Outsiders, 67% think it died during the blackout or shortly thereafter, right? So this is a point where we see some difference of opinion between insiders and outsiders. The graph there is actually a counting graph, like that. Each one of those blocks actually stands for a interviewee.
And so I guess a question I have here is to what extent is there maybe a bit of a difference in semantics? Meaning, you know, you can say, I mean, the bill was collapsing, you know, and then, you know, so it could be the insiders are saying, well, once it started to collapse, it was dead, as opposed to the outsiders who are saying, well, it's only dead when it's dead. And I guess the other point is that sometimes, you know, you have maybe the bill in some forms was dead, you know, before the blackout, but then it was the blackout that killed it in all forms. Meaning, so that's why, you know, it could be, you know, all these things may be true.
We did try to tease that out in the interviews. So when we're saying like this is when the bill died, this is a pretty close approximation to kind of asking those people. And in addition, because one of the questions we asked them is what was the lasting impact. And so for that other question, the 81% of people who thought the bill was dead before the blackout, most of them, I believe, still thought that the blackout was incredibly important to it's not coming back again, to creating a toxic environment for tech policy and certainly copyright policy within the legislative process. So they viewed it as having a very important impact. They just didn't think it's what killed the bill. And we did try to tease those things apart in the interviews.
SOPA dead, we didn't code them as dead unless they literally said the bill could not come back to the floor at this point because the leadership was never going to bring it up. So.
Yeah, the other thing that I was wondering in looking at this and thinking about it was how difficult it is also to sort of tease that information out in retrospect, right? Because now if I sit down and think about it, I can make an argument for the bill dying at a few different points or being close to dead, and yet, you know, there is...
In the moment.
Right, but you know, if you were just to ask me on the fly, like when did it die, like I might just say, you know, the blackout was what really killed it. But then, if we got into a more nuanced argument, but looking back, like that one day, the blackout in January was, you know, had such a widespread impact just in terms of,
It had the biggest,
you know, public perception and everything that,
absolutely.
you know, in retrospect, it almost feels like even having lived through everything that happened leading up to that and after that. You know, it's tough to separate that out. Like, how did I feel at the time? Like, you know, I'm trying to think back. Like on January 17th, did I think the bill was dead? And I'm not sure I remember.
Right. I mean, I think the interesting thing was, and Seb and I were having a conversation about how I said it's really interesting that all these people thought the bill was dead, thought that the blackout was very important, and we're going back and forth like. You know, that doesn't make any sense, but it made sense because it was such an unprecedented event and because it had a broader impact than killing one bill, right?
Yeah.
But you're right, fortunately, a lot of these interviews were 2 years ago, but not all of them were, you know, because there were some people who were not really ready to talk about this, mostly on the other side until last year, and
We can talk a little bit about process
yeah,
later.
later on. Anyway, we're going to go through all these guys in a little bit more.
Yeah.
What's interesting about Mike's point is that it does sort of relate to my earlier point. It's like, you know, your memory after the fact, you know, is right. Or, okay, if you're in the foxhole, I mean, you have one
Absolutely.
perception, but then 20 years later, you know, it's like, oh, it was,
You
you know,
got
this
more
or it was that,
information.
which is something you had no sense of at the time.
Right,
You may have had a completely,
Right.
at the time, you may have had a completely different perception, but
it is-
even a few weeks later, you might already have a, you know, your memory is
Yes.
very
And
unreliable.
people did have unreliable memories around things like, did that happen, was that the hearing where the Republicans started to talk about DNS and Pelosi, wasn't that after the House markup? And so we actually had to go back, and I thought I knew, and I had to go back and like, you know, that's why this enormous timeline is, which there's a lot more to put on it, is useful. But, right, I mean, you had to not take the word of any one person. You had to kind of see,
And doing qualitative work,
yeah,
this is always an
This
issue,
is
right?
what-
And it's, as you said, we're looking for people's opinion, and their opinion in the moment might have been different than their opinion a year later, 2 years later.
Right.
But this is what they told us. All right. Insider disagreements. I think that's, yeah. So, right, here's the stuff that insiders agreed on, right? 81% thought the bill died before the blackout. Okay, here are some disagreements. Insiders who were against the bill thought that poor drafting and unworkable bill language was really important. This was one of those kind of but-for sort of things. Coordination, oh no, these are
These are not
important.
but-for, these are
Sorry,
important.
these are important factors. Coordination and information sharing by bill opponents was viewed as very important, and we're going to talk about the coalition that came together to defeat the bill, whereas insider proponents didn't view that as important at all. You'll see mismanagement by the bill chair, again, Lamar Smith, viewed as very important by the insider proponents of the bill and less important by the insider opponents. In contrast, the general Republican opposition due to regulate the kind of regulatory aspects of the bill was viewed as very important by insiders who were opposed to the bill and less important by insider proponents.
Do you have that broken down by if they were Republicans or not?
No. Whether they were Republicans.
The person that you were like, how
Yeah.
important, if they were Republicans or if they were not,
Yeah.
how important the Republican opposition was to them?
That's a good question.
and we were trying to develop all those demographics, and we don't have
Yeah.
them.
Okay.
I mean, I think what I can say about the Republican opposition
Is that it doesn't break that way.
I don't think it breaks that
Yeah.
way.
Okay.
And
Party
that
affiliations now.
the people who were opposed in D.C., and actually even in the grassroots, there were constant conversations about go Republican, were very, very aware, whether they were companies or anybody else, that there was a very big aggressive strategy of Republicans. And in some of the conversations, because I did most of the content interviews, it just, they were really focused on anger to a particular group, but the fact that there had been a pretty sophisticated strategy around Republicans, it just wasn't clear that that had even come into their thinking about what screwed up the bill.
Yeah, what of these, what's most surprising to me is the discrepancy in the mismanagement of the bill. That the proponents thought that was a big factor, whereas the opponents thought it was a factor, but less so. Because it was, very clear to me that one of the great, because I was, in
Yep.
full disclosure, I was among the opponents. But I'm sure that would shock people in the room. But for me, what was just the, sort of like the endless source of frustration was that, and whether you say this is mismanagement by the chair or maybe again the way the questions are worded, it's mismanagement by staff, that especially on the House side, they just refused to talk to us. I mean, that there was just no, the normal the normal legislative process is, you know, bad bill gets introduced, and then you have all this lobbying, and it sort of, you know, progressively gets better to the point where it's, you know, benign and,
Right.
you know, you can live with it. But here, certainly on the House side, it just never got better, and there was never,
Right.
you know, the normal process of a negotiation or a discussion,
Well, the-
and you can say that's, I guess I see that as mismanagement by the chair or the staff, that they just kind of ran roughshod. And so, and certainly I thought all of us who were opposed had the same views, so that's why I'm surprised that there was this disparity, because it was so obvious to us that one of the problems
Right.
was they weren't negotiating.
Right.
And this was like, how dare they not? I mean, this is America.
So
You
view
negotiate.
this as, this is.
We're gonna look at that a little bit more
We're gonna
closely.
look more at the legislative process, in particular the markup and the hearing. But view this as, these are kind of the areas where there's the greatest disagreement about the weight of a variable.
It's a weight.
And it doesn't say that insiders who were opposed didn't think it was important. It's that insiders who were pro viewed it as way more significant. And there's some very interesting stuff that comes out as to why that was viewed as so important. Yeah.
What was the in-person opposition strategy during markup?
We'll talk about it when we get to the
We'll talk
markup
about
slide.
That's probably about you. That's the Bob Schwartz
Yeah.
line.
So opponent disagreements. So these are things that insiders and outsiders who were opposed to the bill disagreed on. First, general Republican opposition due to regulation, right? The insiders view it as very important, outsiders less important. In contrast, the online blackout is viewed as very important by the outsiders. It's viewed as important, but a little less so by the insiders. Insiders viewed opposition by conservative organizations, in particular Heritage, as very important. Members of Congress being misinformed about the bill's effects, and we'll unpack that a little bit when we talk about a little bit more about the legislative process, was viewed as important to insiders, not outsiders. So a lot of these
DNS,
things,
I think the DNS is
Right.
interesting.
and the
Good
controversy around DNS blocking, insiders view it as more important than outsiders. In contrast, human rights, free speech messaging, outsiders more important than insiders. All right. We're going to do some deep dives. I don't think I skipped a slide, did I? No. All right, and I'm going to turn it over to Leslie for a few, and then I'm
We'll
going to
come
do a
back.
few, and then we're going to come back to Rich.
So, trying to unpack what everybody believed mismanagement of the bill by the chair, and we basically decided one way to do it, because not everybody was in DC, was to also look at how the bill was handled in the Senate versus how it was handled in the House. And that doesn't, another full disclosure, I was an opponent, but having dealt with the Senate and the House on the bill, the shutout was only part of the mismanagement, I think, on the House side. So on the Senate side, they have an open door policy for the proponents and the opponents, and win or lose, the process of developing COICA and the subsequent bill pro-IP, people are going in, they're making their points, they're making changes, they completely changed what an infringing site was based on the input of CDT and PK. So they weren't like, you had no stake in this bill. Everybody was part of the process. They were desperately seeking balance, trying to get at least some companies from the tech sector, plus, keep the ISPs in the room who didn't want a private right of action. I think at the end of the day, they didn't quite get what they wanted. But COICA is evidence that they really, really tried not to have a private right of action, not to do a variety of things and then they just got an overwhelming demand. And they said no to long lists, second level domains, all kinds of things that were on the demand list. The interesting thing is the whole time the House is making clear to the Senate the bill doesn't go far enough. The interesting thing is that the Senate understood that if this bill was going to pass, it needed to be a bill that could go by unanimous consent. That IP bills generally have not gone to the floor, correct me, Jonathan, if I'm wrong, with like a rule to have lots and lots of amendments. It's worked out in advance. In the House, it even goes on suspension. So they are looking for, they immediately start to negotiate with tech in July. And basically, the House process begins, and at that point, there's really no reason for tech to be negotiating in the Senate because they've got something much, what they're negotiating on is like nothing compared to what's in the House. Part of that is also because of the widen hold. And when we do the interviews about the widen hold, you get, well, there's a hold on every bill, and, we always win the vote to bring the bill up, so, it was annoying, but it wasn't that big a deal. But when you look at why they didn't get this bill to the floor at the beginning, COICA, the very first bill, but for the widen hold, they would have brought that to the floor in December of 2010. So it had an important impact. It had an important impact the following year when they had already had to bring the America Invents Act to the floor. They didn't have much floor time, and they get themselves in a circumstance which people in the Senate said was the worst thing that could possibly happen, because everything's happening in the House, and they have, the leadership announces in December that they're going to do this thing in January, basically making it pretty impossible to think they were ever going to get the bill brought up because they had to have time to go through the motion to proceed. So Wyden actually had, I think, a bigger impact than people in Washington are kind of willing to say.
We have one comment from the floor.
Yes.
Can you identify yourself?
Oh, yeah. I'm Zach Roca from the Free Software Foundation, and this is great info, but you guys can just give like a little more background when you introduce each event or concept.
Oh, I'm
Sure.
sorry.
Helpful for
DC folks, sorry.
Got it. Why didn't hold COICA like I remember them?
Yeah, okay.
You bet.
Okay.
2 sentences.
Yeah,
You got
so,
it.
right. So COICA was the first bill that happened in the fall of 2010 in the Senate and had a much smaller universe of people paying attention, all the people up here, and was obviously a bill everybody opposed, but it didn't have all of the things in it by the time you got to SOPA. The widen hold, so for non-DC people, if a senator puts a hold on a bill, means he's not consenting to the bill to go to the floor before they can actually begin to debate the bill. They have to have another whole process called a motion to proceed, where they have to go through an entire vote to go to the floor.
It has to be a senator that's like that committee.
No, any senator.
No. And in this case, Wyden winds up with Rand Paul and who else? Jerry Moran.
And one
yeah,
more,
yeah,
but I forgot who it was.
Me too.
And you can do these sequentially.
Right, and you can keep doing them over and over again. It's part of our dysfunction.
Or function.
Or function, depending on, it's like the holds and the filibusters. Having been here a long time, I have found, screeds from the Republicans, their right to filibuster, and then 4 years later, the Democrats. So, but this is, the only thing that's happened on holds that's different now is that they used to be totally secret, and
Yeah.
now people are pretty willing to go public with
Yeah,
their holds.
it used to be that you had the option of doing it in secret. You could do it publicly or in secret. The widen hold was public.
Was public from
even
day
though
one.
he could have done it in secret, but he did
Right,
it publicly.
but he
So he put
definitely
a
did.
hold on that bill and basically killed COICA in 2010, which led to the attempt to revive COICA was pro-IP in 2011.
in the
Well,
Senate.
it was protect IP.
Protect
Pro-
IP.
Protect
You're right, I'm sorry.
We are
Yeah.
using
Right,
the
right.
formal names.
Pro-IP,
Adam, did you have
pro-IP
something?
was
the
a bill
previous-
before,
yeah.
right.
Adam,
Protect IP, yeah.
Little.
Or PIPA.
2 words.
Can you introduce yourself so other people?
I'm Adam Meister, I'm with the American Library. Small footnote, nowhere in the Senate rules will you find anything
About
small
it.
holds or
Right.
not holds. They are purely a creature of custom of the Senate, and sometimes senators who haven't played their cards right get hold, but not in this case.
Right, yeah. So, all right, so we switched to the House, and the House has spent the entire last year telling the Senate, even as there's increasing controversy, that the bill's no good and it doesn't go far enough.
So,
Yeah,
there was, so I just wanted to bring up, because I was noticing that I think it missing or different, or I have just a different recollection, which is, I remember in 2011, so after Protect IP came out and everyone was waiting for the House bill, what the talk was that,
It was gonna be better.
well, that it may be better, and but that it was Goodlatte who was writing the bill.
We are going to talk about
Okay.
this.
I will
Yep.
talk about that because,
Okay.
because
It's very important.
Right.
it's extremely important, and this may really seem arcane to people on the outside, but you have a chair of a subcommittee
No,
that's.
no, go through this and then get to that. 'Cause you have a whole slide on this.
Yeah,
And then Mike
okay.
will get to,
All right, then we'll get to it, and
Right.
we'll talk about it.
Yeah.
Okay, so instead, as you said, there's this closed-door process. People don't get to go in, people don't get to talk. Interviewees are talking about being shut out. We tried to reach out, we didn't get far with the staff. And this is an interview from somebody in content. I look back to the greed part. There were those in our community saying, give us more, and they did. They then had this unbalanced and uninformed House hearing, which was mostly a Get Google hearing, and that's the hearing where everything, I'll talk about in a moment, everything converges. American Censorship Day is happening, so millions of people are watching this mess. It's the day that Stuart Baker, who's the former General Counsel of Homeland Security, and I think of NSA, comes out with a letter and an op-ed about the danger of harnessing the DNS for copyright or any other aim. You see people on the Republicans on the committee for the first time sort of saying, what? And of course, all of this is happening because of American Censorship Day. Millions of people are seeing this, which I don't think would have happened except for that. And then this goes on to a markup. Between that hearing and the markup, they changed the bill a little bit, but there aren't any negotiations. There's no real change in sort of the approach to the bill. And then they have basically a markup from hell, which I'll talk about, where... yeah.
And this is, again,
Yeah.
now my memory is not... Did the House agree to remove DNS? Was that before the markup?
Oh, no.
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 And there was, and it's still not entirely clear whether it formally happened. I'll explain it
Okay.
in a second.
No, okay, sorry, no, okay, now it's,
Right,
yeah.
yeah.
So, but there were some significant changes between the
Well, that's what's really
There were.
interesting,
committee
and this,
the-
and this comes out a lot in the unhappiness of our interviews with the content community, because he cuts the bill dramatically, so maybe it's now Protect IP plus a few bad things.
Right.
As
Because they took out the private right of action,
They took out
right? That's
They
what it
took
was?
out, no, they took out the
I'm
language
sorry.
that required the companies, like, if you were, if, you know, it wasn't a complete monitoring, but it gave them, what was it? It was like, they had this obligation if they saw something. It was kind of breaking.
It was improved. I can't even. I mean,
I know,
again, it was a long time ago already. I can't remember. There was improvement.
It was an improvement. They took out that, I'm
but-
calling it the Viacom language, because they were trying to get this.
Well, yeah, there was the vigilante.
The vigilante.
provision.
So it was slightly better, but of course, there's all this grassroots organizing going on, and it turns out to be a lot of, in our interviews, real unhappiness, like the grassroots is now organizing around a bill that doesn't exist. And
Right,
what's the matter
because
with
that
it,
was
right?
the thing that I remember was everyone was the proponents of the bill pushing back very strongly and saying, after, you know, for the
Right.
manager's amendment for the markup was so different that it fixed all the problems,
So
and
why
people are
don't-
complaining about a bill
Right.
that doesn't exist.
That
Yeah.
doesn't exist,
Right.
and you basically have, I'll come back to this. I'm kind of doing these slides while we talk, but
And what's
I do wanna
interesting,
do that.
what's interesting about Mike's point is yeah, to some extent, I mean that you saw the same dynamic with ACTA, which was happening simultaneously, where
Do
where a
people
lot
know
of-
what ACTA is?
that
Just so
was
I-
the anti-counterfeiting
Because
trade agreement, which was a group of like 40 countries, including the U.S. and the EU, had negotiated this agreement, and there was some opposition here, but much more opposition in Europe, and to a large extent, a lot of the opposition in Europe was focusing on earlier drafts. I mean, a lot of the specific concerns were ones that had been addressed, and one of the answers to that process point where people say, well, gee, you're complaining about something that wasn't there before, is well, that's, you know, to some extent, it's a function of the lack of transparency and bad process, meaning
Right.
if there had been a more open process
Right.
of
Right.
the amendment or whatever, then, you know, it would have been, you know, the likelihood of people getting upset and the timing would have been different, but
Right.
because, you know, things were happening so quickly, and then they sort of, to the extent that there was an improvement, but it was, you know, some of it too little too late, and,
Right.
And you didn't even know there was an improvement
Right,
until the markup.
because it isn't
There
like,
was, right?
so this comes up a lot, and it does raise this interesting question about how do we do sort of rational policymaking in DC? Because if you do something like the first Smith draft of SOPA, you know, I called it, you know, the right to be forgotten provision was what content wanted. They wanted basically somehow that all the people who had read this online and every tweet, somehow that should disappear when the markup starts and the bill is slightly better. But by that time, people had moved into kill mode. It was no longer, how are we going to amend this? So I'm going to back up, but I've probably gone through some of these slides. But I want to identify, it's interesting because as part of the inside opponents, I don't think we completely appreciated at the time how important the American censorship campaign was as a but-for moment. We were living it, yes.
15 seconds
Yes.
on what American censorship?
Yes, absolutely. It's the next
You
slide.
got it.
You get. So you see here that the insiders against either didn't mention it because they were talking about their strategy. I mean, part of this has to do with everybody had their piece of the elephant and they defined it as the elephant. That I'll go to it. So the American censorship campaign is a big online day of action that is the first activity of what is the SOPA coalition. And so there's two but-for moments. One is when this coalition comes together, which is right after the Smith bill is released, and Mozilla calls a meeting.
I'm sorry, SOPA Coalition is pro or against?
SOPA coalition is against.
Against.
SOPA coalition is against. This is the right.
Anti-SOPA coalition.
Anti-SOPA coalition. So there is a big meeting call that Mozilla organizes, because Mozilla does not get involved in public policy except if they think it has to do with the architecture of the internet. And they feel pretty strongly that all this DNS stuff is the architecture of the internet. And there's a really big call, and in DC everybody thinks Google organized this, but it was Mozilla. And it's the birth of this coalition, and it's kind of the first time that all of the people in the sort of DC advocacy community and these emerging grassroots organizations and, you know, engine advocacy, not everybody had been talking to each other, and basically a very big, very robust, and very diverse coalition forms. And the first thing that gets planned by this coalition is literally the day of the hearing that they are going to do a call-in day, you know, a very visible day of action.
Yeah. So the original plan, because I was
Yes.
in the meeting,
Yes,
right?
you
So
were. I was on the phone.
the original plan was it was called American Censorship Day,
Blackout.
and the idea was that everyone, opponents of the bill, would black out their
Blackout.
website, right? So everyone remembers the January 18th where sites did that, but the original idea was to do that in November during the hearing, the judiciary hearing, and there were a few different discussions about how that would work and what it would look like and whether or not you could actually get sites to black themselves out.
And whether it would, given what was happening in Washington, whether that would be the most impactful.
Right.
to do.
And but that was the one that people sort of coalesced around,
Right.
and it was a suggestion from the Fight for the Future guys were
Right.
the ones who brought that up.
It really was.
Now what's interesting is, I have no recollection of the American
I know.
Censorship Day. I have no recollection of this Mozilla meeting. Maybe I wasn't invited.
You would have a recollection. 'Cause it was-
But I had been already working you know, for 2 years, you know, first against COICA, on behalf of, you know, several of my clients, and then, you know, SOPA and PIPA. And, you know, we had a coalition all the way back, you know, against COICA. And it was the same.
It was the same DC
It
crowd
was the
that we
same,
always.
right, it was the same people, you know, that who had already been working together, as you said before, or as Peter said before, since you know, the Digital Future Coalition that was working on the DMCA, you know, a lot of the people in this room, you know, we had already been working together, so that's why, you know, it's very, I'm not denying that there was this pivotal point of inflection, but all I'm saying is I had no awareness of it, and so
that's really interesting,
you know,
because you know we were just said get on this call.
yeah, and
Yeah,
again,
so
it
the-
could have been that.
And PK certainly was on.
And it could be that
Yeah.
my clients were on the call, but, you know, as their outside lawyer, you know, who was doing the technical stuff, it could be they just said, you know,
Maybe
So
so.
the-
that I didn't need to be on that call.
Because this is
So-
really, really.
Because
difficult.
so at least my recollection of it, right? So it was, so the call was for people in DC. In Silicon Valley,
meeting.
it was a meeting. We all got together and in Mountain View, and there were a lot of people there.
Was there food?
And
I don't think so.
yes,
Really?
Mozilla did serve food.
Mozilla must have been very serious to serve food.
I recall, I believe that there was food served. But what was interesting was that there were all these people and so there were all these people, sort of the DC people who had been sort of fighting this fight, and then they were on the phone. Most of the people in the room were not people who had any experience in policy. There were some, absolutely some, but there were a lot of people who did not have any experience in policy, and they had a very different outlook. And this is purely subjective from sort of where I was sitting, and what I saw was that you had the DC people who sort of were resigned to this process of being, this is a terrible, terrible bill, it's terrible for the internet, we're going to fight, we're going to yell, we're going to make a lot of noise, and then we're going to lose. Right? And that was the thought process. We're going to lose, but let's make as much noise as we can. There were people in that room who had no experience with any of this or any policy making at all, who said, this is a terrible bill, we have to stop it, and they meant it. And I didn't believe them either that they could do it. I thought we were going to lose. But like there were people in that room who set off a different chain of events, and I think like the DC stuff was super important, and everything that was going on here, and all the people who had the experience and the background and the knowledge and understood the legislative process, as opposed to the people who didn't, right, were super important in terms of making that happen. But these people who had none of that experience, but also the very important, you know, naive approach,
Willingness to try anything.
and to believe that they could actually kill that bill, made a huge difference, and it was that meeting that sort of set off the process that got those two groups working together.
And I think that was the part. Please add.
And I just wanted to, this is in part, Jonathan, I think unintentionally or maybe intentionally, flags a really important issue that there's one book out, Bill Herman, media scholar, and he was writing about digital rights management technology and looking at the debates around the AHRA and the DMCA, and he concludes with a chapter about SOPA. These are all other legislative battles around this sort of issue. Copyright was some technology piece, right? And it's interesting because he frames it as the Fair Use Coalition coming into their full form. And I think you just made I was like, no, Bill, that's not the Fair Use Coalition. That the Fair Use Coalition was part of this coalition, but it was a much broader set of actors, many of whom had never really played in this particular copyright issue at all. The technologists who generally were neutral on IP issues, period, right? They're creators, they want a patent, they want copyrights, they want it, right? And so this coalition, and I think your story about, you're like, I don't even know this happened, and given your centrality in the Digital Future Coalition, and I can tell you some of your clients were in this meeting.
Yes.
But I think it speaks to the fact that this was a different.
I don't get any respect.
No. Right. that, you know, it was a different, broader, it was a coalition
Yeah.
of coalitions, which I think is part of the story.
Right, and I think what Mike said is that was really, really interesting is bringing together these very different skill sets, visions, was extraordinarily powerful. I remember sitting in a room in Washington, and I don't remember who is explaining some big crazy action, and somebody wrote next to me, "What do we know?" And I said, "Not much," because what were we going to say? In a traditional legislative battle, what they had proposed seemed loony, but their energy, their creativity, and on the other hand, you know, chutzpah. On the other hand, you know, they would say, "We're running off to go after Senator so-and-so," and DC would say, "Republicans, Republicans, Republicans, Republicans," and you actually have to go to their offices. So it was really powerful, and the reason that this coordination and communication ranks so high is that there really was this listserv, which we're not going to talk much about today. Our future work is really doing serious content analysis, that is a rich resource of how these different communities support each other, educate each other, argue with each other, and I don't think there's anything like that has come out of anything else. Anyway, so we consider everything about that creation story, whether it's what happened at Mozilla or that first action, to be but 4 moments. And American Censorship Day itself is pretty darn big, but it doesn't really register in most ways. But if you look at the numbers,
So there's two interesting things about that, and I don't know how much of this is included in it.
Yeah.
So one is that the American Censorship Day was at the same time as the Judiciary hearing, so the two of them may get lumped together, and people sort
right,
of
that's my next slide, yeah.
associate the two. The other is that for the people who were planning American Censorship Day, there were all these plans. We knew all these different sites that were involved and engaged in it, but the one that took most of us, I think, completely by surprise was that Tumblr engaged on it, and Tumblr had not been a part of the coalition up to that point, and hadn't been involved, hadn't been at that meeting, hadn't been on the email list. Nobody knew that they were involved, and then on American Censorship Day, they put up a thing so that anyone who logged into Tumblr, it got this big message, I don't remember what it said, but something to the effect of, the internet is going to die, click here to call your congressperson now. And that's what the 90,000 calls,
Most of the time.
a large percentage of them came from Tumblr, who wasn't even a part of, so, you know,
You see this like
Very
Like,
loose coalition.
like,
well,
yes, like
but this growing,
you know,
right,
the-
so.
yes, that's right, go ahead.
Anyway, so we're really prepared to say that, you know, and I'm one of the people in DC who, you know, we were giving them suggestions, but in terms of the visibility, I don't
Say
care.
later.
Later, I
Sorry.
don't care about iCloud. That when you look at all the data together, and which happens in the next slide, and the fact that it's happening at this House hearing, that all the fumbling and bumbling and screw-ups of this House hearing, which were manifest. This is the hearing where, you know, there's a discussion of DNS, and people are getting up and basically saying, "I know nothing about the internet, but I'm going to support this." Well, because of American Censorship Day, which had already gotten so many more eyeballs onto this issue, this inflames people. So this is kind of where strategies come together, and we're going to talk about the DNS strategy if we have time later. But basically, the grassroots strategy and a principal part, at least for civil society in Washington, which is around DNS, come together at this hearing, because this is the hearing where you get the former NSA General Counsel Republican to come out and state the same concerns about this bill that the technologists working with civil society. You get the important Republicans who are also on committees that have to do with security, sort of saying, wait a minute, we need to slow down, we're worried about this. The next day is when Nancy Pelosi suddenly tweets about the bill. So you have a really important moment here, because American Censorship Day itself was incoming, but the fact that there was a hearing at the same time, and such a badly managed hearing, kind of turned it into, what was it, what's the late night theater that always makes me laugh? Mystery Science, absolutely, Mystery Science Theater. Because I knew, it's like all nerds know. Mystery Science Theater, I knew, and I knew you'd know. I knew you'd know. It was Mystery Science Theater. People would sit in the audience and they were just saying certain things in a room and you could do a whole riff on what that was about. And it was extremely important.
So if I could,
Oh,
We got a whole chunk, yeah.
so if I might jump in, just one thing about the hearing that that is at least for me that I took away from it in terms of why it was important and lasting impact was that the Copyright Office, Maria Palente, the Registrar of the Copyright Office, testified at that hearing. In her testimony, she basically did not identify.
it's a hearing the year before.
Oh, is that right? It was a whole year before?
It was those crazy parasites and something sites here.
Well, no, let him.
But go ahead, because
anyway,
this is very important.
But I think that just shows how fickle
I only know
and
this
tricky
because I've had
memory
to-
is.
yeah.
Is that at that hearing, the Copyright Office basically said the bill is fine. It kind of didn't identify any problems, and by failing to identify any problems, it in essence legitimized the bill and its very sweeping nature. And not only did it not identify problems, it didn't even sort of engage, to the extent that it engaged at all, the opposition was very dismissive. And
Excuse me, is Copyright Office part of Library Conference?
yes,
For now.
right.
Yes, it's like sometimes.
But in essence, that testimony to some extent greenlighted
Absolutely.
SOPA and
Lack of opposition equals support. I mean,
Excuse me?
Lack of opposition from the Copyright Office amounted to support.
It
Right,
was more
and-
than lack of opposition.
It was.
right. It basically
They were friendly.
and in terms of so I think that helped really get things moving very quickly. The failure to recognize any problems or identify any overbreadth in the bill. And then in terms of lasting opposition, I think it was that testimony that really got the attention of a lot of people in Silicon Valley, is to say, well, wait a minute, how is this possible? And I think that testimony has really galvanized in terms of the tech community or certain sectors in terms of being aware of what is the nature of the beast. In other words, what is it like in Washington copyright policy circles, and how to what extent is there a disconnect between Washington policy making even the technical experts, right, the technical experts in Washington vis-a-vis, the rest of the world.
The other thing that was important about the hearing on the American Censorship Day, in terms of sort of galvanizing the internet, was that it became the overwhelming story on Reddit at the time.
Absolutely.
And one of Reddit's co-founders, Alexis Ohanian, suddenly sort of jumped in on that day and said, like, this is crazy. And he started watching the live stream of the hearing and was commenting on it as it was going on, and that got more and more people on Reddit interested in the bill and sort of started a chain reaction
So it was
as
an
well.
enormous sort of
Yeah.
viral event. But in Washington, they were in a closet rewriting the bill with nobody knowing that they were doing that. These are just the numbers, just to give you again. But I think they're kind of past numbers at this point. That's what I think. Yeah.
Not quick clarifying question. So, like, American Censorship Day was in November, and then the big blackout was in January.
Yes.
So it was like the same tactic, right?
Yes.
And
So
big.
the blackout,
The
yeah.
blackout really, yeah,
It was
a combination.
the basically the identical, the blackout was, the idea was originally to do that in November, and that became American Censorship Day. And the hope was that American Censorship Day was going to be much bigger and would involve sites like Google and Wikipedia and all that, and it didn't. And so the January blackout was basically take two that got a lot more people engaged.
And I would say, you know, and this might be jumping ahead, but I think in terms of the, you know, in terms of the in terms of the ultimate political impact, I think, you know, the blackout was much more significant because to some extent, and this is sort of like all the stuff, you know, all the, you know, the fact that, you know, Tumblr, Reddit, whatever, it's like, well, people here don't know, in those days,
Right.
didn't even know what those were. I mean, those are meaningless, I mean, who knows, what difference does that make?
Well, they knew they
But
got,
but
they knew
Tumblr
they got
made the
got the-
phones
they
ring.
knew
got the
that their
phones.
phones rang.
The phones
But I
rang.
think it was,
They knew that their phones were-
but the fact that once Google put something on its, you know, it went the, you know, they what did they go black or what was it?
They had
They had
something
their logo blacked out.
blacked out,
Right.
and then they,
Google quite properly could not deny services
Yeah.
because the
Right.
market
Right.
they did signal to-
Right, but then,
And
but
they-
then the
and
fact that
then
they had a
Wikipedia, but it
page that
was
you could-
that plus Wikipedia
Right.
that went totally dark that day.
right.
Those two, at least, you know, that really got the attention of people in Congress and inside the Beltway far more than any of this other stuff, because these are things that they use every single day, right? Those
Yeah.
two,
So hold on.
Wait,
Yeah, 'cause
let's,
the data might.
Mike,
just want-
Mike, were you at Wikimedia at the time, or Wikipedia?
I was at Wikimedia,
Yeah.
and I had been brought in and was working day by day from October on, from Lake Coweta on through the winter into January on, with not just the Wikipedia blackout in January 2012, but the Italian Wikimedia blackout in October of
That's right.
2012. And I had actually, when I was general counsel, had been promoting blackouts on a country basis based on laws, where promoting means telling the community, you know, you can do this. And
Yeah.
and the Italians, perhaps not surprisingly to some people, were very quick to strike, to go on strike when they have the opportunity. In response to Berlusconi's wiretap law, and it happened in October. Well, what happened is because as an international community, that particular experience in Italy informed, you know, Redditors and informed the outsider community that there was potential for collective action that might actually have a political impact. And in terms of herding cats, getting the Wikimedia English language, the Wikipedians to agree on this, which had to happen, could not have happened without the Italian one happening in October. So at this point, you begin to see in social media or quasi-social media platforms like Reddit consensus that the collective action is possible. And then that actually fed into, so to some extent, when you ask the question about whether the blackout in January was a critical point, everyone knew it was coming, right? We all knew, everybody knew on the whisper channel that this was all happening. But we had this success. I just wanted to underscore that we had had material success in the external world.
Right.
Yeah, I don't think anybody, and we've interviewed people who were in the know, actually talked about the Italian experience.
did not.
Which is,
That's right, not inside. The insiders absolutely did not.
no, even the outsiders.
Nobody did.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean it didn't happen.
people-
We're
No,
learning
I
from
know,
it.
I'm actually, we've learned, we did a presentation this morning and we're getting new data, so I
Right.
want to talk to you more about it.
All right.
Yeah.
I will.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so we've talked about like this,
The hearing.
yeah, this hearing, this but-for moment, what's happening in the grassroots. We will go back and explain what the DNS controversy was about, but meanwhile, it's been put on the table among many, many Republicans. Nobody inside is responding to it. So that is beginning to grow as a major problem. And basically, I think it's the point where Republicans begin to become very concerned about the bill. I think it's also the point where the tech industry starts to see a breaking down of this, you know, we're just going to delay and maybe we have to figure out a way to compromise this
Talk about the
bill.
markup.
So you get to the markup. At this point, you get this fresh bill from the chairman, which only appears that day, and the expectation somehow that the grassroots will all say, "Oh, never mind," is really an interesting finding for you know, people in D.C. who are saying, "How can we ever have a regular order? This is what happens the day of a markup. Somebody has a fresh bill, we negotiate it, and now And I mean, I think it's a serious issue, but I think it was Mike's point. It suggests you have to have now a different level of transparency is required. You can't just be dropping bills along the way. So basically, it's too late. And this is where the tech sector has their day of rage, big time. They're working at this point with Chaffetz and ISA and Politz and Lofgren, and they've got 70 amendments, and they're forcing a reading of the bill. You're smiling, it was fun.
No, I'm just looking at and smiling at Bob, who wrote most of the amendments.
Yeah, well, there's that too. And
A bunch of people wrote it.
a lot of people.
And the last minute rewrite of the bill actually made it more exquisite to write amendments, because it made it all that much more complicated, and it exposed the number of folks who were sitting up there as members of the committee who had no idea what they were
Had no idea what was going on.
working through the amendments
Right.
to show they didn't understand the
Right.
bill in the first place.
Did not understand the bill. The goal at this point is mostly about delay. And again, one of the things we find from our interviews is that you know, Smith is up there, they're winning the votes on amendments, and there is a large number of people interviewed who are sitting through that and say, we're winning.
On the pro-SOPA side?
On the pro-SOPA side.
Yeah.
There is a subset who basically says it's over, we're done, this level of controversy, we're never gonna get this bill to the floor. But a remarkable number see this as what happens, and then you get out of committee, and then you all get in a room like many of us used to, and you work it out, and something will go to the floor. What really happens is they suspend the markup, don't finish the markup. It's the holiday break, it festers, and my favorite quote is, they left a dead elephant carcass in the sun to bake. And from a Republican office. So the deadly, this is a deadly delay, and now the online organizing and the growing opposition is completely free to expand. And a lot of other prominent voices start to speak out on this, using the DNS system to block infringing sites. Could have just said that earlier and that would have made it easier, right? And Republicans are split, and people are saying there's no way for this bill to get to the floor. Another thing happens, which I think is important and overlooked. Darrell Issa decides he's going to have his own hearing on this DNS fight. Let me just say, from a Washington perspective, for somebody who sits on a committee, to use their own committee, to have a hearing about what's on somebody else's committee, is so far outside the regular order. If you want to know what the Tea Party is yelling about regular order, they don't like any of this regular order. And Smith goes crazy. He goes to the leadership. A member of the leadership calls from Europe to speak to ISA and basically says, what can I do to get you not to have this hearing? And basically, he gets a commitment, basically, that this bill will not go to the floor unless there's a majority of the caucus in agreement. So there are people who know about that, and that is very inside baseball, who think the bill was dead then. Now,
And the important thing is, ICE's hearing was supposed to be January 18th.
right, so it was pretty close in time at this point, but that conversation happened.
Right. No, that happened before, but
This happened.
the reason that the blackout
That the date
day
was
was
ticked.
January 18th was because that was going to be the day of ICE's hearing that had
Right.
a bunch of anti-SOPA people on that.
That's
And so
right.
they were trying to recreate the American Censorship Day, time it to another hearing, and then that hearing disappeared, but the
day went
blackout
on.
went on.
So, so basically, there's some process going on that is not a committee process that starts somewhere in here from the House hearing and through the holiday, which is an attempt to come up with some kind of legislative deal. We've been told it exists. Very few people acknowledge that it exists, but obviously it was too late at that point. And I guess this is now again showing us some data on who saw this as major importance. And so you see the markup becomes the insiders, for and against, both see this as extremely important in the markup,
So
more
yeah,
so than
yeah.
the outsiders.
So the thing that I think was the most important is not necessarily the markup itself, but Smith not finishing the markup.
Well,
And
yeah.
so that's the one piece that honestly I still don't understand how that
And-
happened
and-
or why that happened.
And
Like
Michael,
why he didn't.
we asked everybody that question, and we got everything from, he was so angry that he didn't know what to do, or he didn't know what to do next, or
He's too nice.
he's too nice and people walked all over him and they should have brought
in cots.
in cots and stayed in the room till it was done. But nobody came up with a, you know,
A good nobody. There's
and,
no
and,
definitive.
and it could well have been that there was, I mean, I don't know, you know, I don't know. I mean, he needed to finish it, but they were also going out of session, so I think there's also some
Right,
other things.
they were running out of session, but there was a point where he sort of threatened to keep everyone
did
there
threaten.
until it finished, and then all of a sudden he came back and said,
Goodbye.
you know, goodbye, we'll be back in January, and it was that moment.
Right, yeah.
You know, my perspective at least was that, you know, the anti-SOPA side was losing during most of that markup because every amendment was going the wrong way.
Right.
Every amendment vote was going absolutely the wrong way. And then they were stretching it out and there was delay and delay and delay. But when he said, you know, we'll pick this up in a month, that's when, you know.
And I think that's
Yes.
mostly like, right, but the insiders who were involved in the strategy and knew for a variety of reasons that leadership was going to be really loath to bring up any bill that looked that controversial, and that the chairman had lost control. And there's a long story of how this relates to the America Protects, what is it, American Invents Act.
American Invents Act.
And the mess on the floor with that bill. So there were all of these insider knowledge that had to do with, you could make this bill so controversial that they will never bring it up. So they identified both pieces.
Right, so delay and controversy were the strategies that the NEC Coalition and CEA and the Gang of Four were pursuing. Didn't think they could necessarily kill the bill,
Right.
but if they could buy enough time, they thought perhaps there was an opportunity to kill it.
Yes.
Lofgren, ISA, Chaffetz, and
Polis.
Hollis. Yeah.
Not the only members who are involved, but the ones who were locked
Yeah,
in a
so
room.
if you, I'm sure the video is somewhere, like if you go back and you look at the video of the markup, it was basically those four just, I mean, it's not filibustering, but it's
pretty close.
Pretty close.
And they got
But
it.
also, and why that's important is, I mean, two of those names have been in the news in the last week, right? Chaffetz and ISA are both, you know, running for speaker. I mean, so these guys
Big
are
Republicans.
big-time Republicans. And
Big time conservative.
right, so
Yeah.
having them involved and sort of, it really legitimized the opposition.
Right.
You know, because until then it was like, you know, you're a bunch of crazy people, or, you know, who are, you know, no one
Who cares about
no one
Reddit?
took us seriously. But when you have those two guys, and you know, and it's also, you know, there's always more backstory. So ISA used to be, when he was in business, he was the president of CEA, the Consumer Electronics Association, Bob Spine, and so he, you know, so that was his, so he, you know, had a degree of sensitivity, understand whatever you want to say, to that position. Chaffetz, I think, was more sort of like a, you know, sort of a anti-government regulation perspective. But the fact that the two of them were on our side really was enormously important. And also, Chaffetz less so at the time, but certainly ISA was, you know, had very good relationships with leadership. I mean, he was a committee chairman at the time, and it was a government affair, so he was really beating up on the Obama administration. So again,
That
had
was
a lot
important too.
of
because
had a lot of
Southern California, like San Diego.
Yeah.
And it was somewhat surprising that the two of them came out so strongly against it and were so forceful.
So we're going to talk about the Republican strategy in a minute. Some of the things that I just want to flag coming out of the markup, because they're important for this next piece, is that a lot of I'm sorry, the feedback is bothering me. I don't know if it's move
Closer
closer. is ISA, he goes rogue on the DNS issue, right? And so there's a significant, all of a sudden, this DNS issue, which has not been anyone who's viewed as kind of the core stakeholders in industries' top issue, is all of a sudden becoming a legislative top
Can
issue.
you do 2 seconds on what it is? 'Cause
I'm going to,
Thank you.
but I just want to note that the issue that kind of surfaces is this DNS issue. Okay. Sorry. The technologists report in the controversy around DNS, so this is using the domain name system to deal with infringing sites. I'm not going to go into the technical issues in any detail because it's not a good use of our time. But it's basically hijacking the architecture of the internet using particularly a technical standard as a mechanism of dealing with copyright issues and also counterfeiting issues. 31% of the people who we interviewed believe that the report, there was a technologist report that came out, I'm going to talk about it in a second, was a major point of injury. And 59% of them viewed that the controversy around the issue was important. You can see opponents and supporters have different opinions about the DNS blocking issue. Opponents believe that it was a problem for cybersecurity, it was breaking a technical standard, and that it could create a precedent for using the technical architecture of the internet to censor for other purposes, right? So they were very concerned about this. Supporters believed ISPs were already doing it extensively in other places. They thought that other countries using DNS blocking were doing it for IP issues.
China.
Right. They thought that the DNSSEC standard could be changed to take account of the law, that the technical standard should bend to the will of the legislature, and finally, that this was a technical problem. And, if we tell them what to do, the technologists will fix it. Right?
That was the big,
Yeah, period.
always.
So what happened, right? This issue ends up being very important. It ends up being something that, to the extent the Republicans in the House markup pick up an issue, this is the issue they pick up. So why have we gotten so far in this process, right? Every bill has had some use of the DNS system in it. Why did we get to this point in the legislative process and not have kind of had a full vetting on the DNS issues? Well, there was basically no public process on the DNS issues. There was no trusted source of technical advice for Congress. No industry sector was perceived as the stakeholder, actively opposed DNS or insisted on dropping it. It was supported by rights holders. The position of ISPs was really unclear, as we're going to talk about, but perceived as supportive. It was not a bottom line for the tech sector. It becomes an exceedingly important tactical issue right at the point in the House markup, and we believe it becomes a fulcrum issue after the House markup because it signals a tipping point where this desire to negotiate goes away, not on the part of content, but on the part of the tech sector. And it's not an issue for VCs or entrepreneurs. That's not the big thing that they're talking about. So who leads the opposition? Well, civil society and the technologists themselves lead the opposition to this issue. The tech sector, it certainly mattered, but it was the bottom of their list, behind private right of action, litigation costs, and this information locator tools definition, all things I'm happy to talk about later. So what explains the silence of the ISPs? We have a whole slew of technologists coming out saying that this is going to break the internet, this is a huge important issue. There's a whole range of issues that emerge as reasons for ISPs to be silent in our interviews. They had more important business before other congressional committees, particularly mergers. Need for they're negotiating contracts with content, and there's issues about not being able to successfully do that. There's a parallel sort of process, the 6 strikes negotiation that's going along in a private ordering context, and some concern that those two things are going to have blowback. They had mixed views on the DNSSEC, and they not only had mixed views among the different companies, but engineers in companies had different views than some of the company representatives in the policy process. So there's a lot of divisiveness. there's increasing ISP concern about the private right of action and how that relates to the DNS issue, in particular, a belief that the content side and that legislators believe that somehow or other there's an automated process for dealing with this particular use of the domain name system, where the ISPs are like, no, if we have thousands or whatever of these, this is a manual process. This is not an automated process, so it's not
Let me pick up.
manageable.
I think this is a relevant question.
Yeah, it's a question about this, the incentives for them. Like, I know that the bill would have required the ISPs and other bodies to do all
Right.
sorts of weird, annoying shit.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, like,
was it supposed to be like all this censorship and all this? Like, were the ISPs just expected to just pay for it? Or like, was law
Well, the
enforcement
cost of it was an issue. Yes.
that
and
was certainly an issue.
cost was a big issue for them. But unlike the DMCA, during the DMCA process, the ISPs basically use their blocking power to say, we're not going to go along with this unless you deal with our issues. They got a carve out, right? The pipe, right? And here that didn't happen. They stayed relatively silent publicly. So how did it become a major point of injury for SOPA? Civil society emerged from our interviews as the key strategists, and they were important as connectors and boundary spanners. Public knowledge, EFF, CDT led the opposition to DNS, and they built the collaboration with technologists. Dan Kaminsky was very important, both a report that he wrote as well as lobbying that he did. EFF wrote a letter going all the way back to COICA with 87 technologists, and note the timeline of this issue, right? That this was an issue that was raised by technologists, by credible people, all the way back in COICA, still hasn't been dealt with at the right? And we're at the markup.
In the House.
Yeah, but it
Please.
wasn't. I mean, Net Coalition, which was
Right.
the predecessor to the Internet Association, so it was all the big internet companies and CCA. I mean, we were pushing the opposed to this issue, the domain name blocking.
As the number one issue?
Not
No.
the number one issue, but it was very much, it was one of the things, so again, the point is the opposition didn't come out of thin air. It was.
No,
it was
For sure.
I agree with you. I will say this, which is interesting. I mean, looking at the negotiations that started in the Senate between the companies and the Judiciary Committee, which happens pretty early, this is not on the list
At all.
at all. And no.
I'll go back. I mean, my talking points.
It was a talking point.
Yeah.
It was a very important tactic because it was so big.
But it was, I mean, and I'll back up Jonathan here.
Yeah.
I know because the day that SOPA was released, I was in DC.
SOPA was released, yeah.
SOPA was released in October. I was in DC doing
Yes.
meetings on the Hill with people from DNS organizations
Yeah.
talking about that issue.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
before
With DNS organizations.
But no. But
Yeah.
my recollection is also that my
Right.
my amended version of COICA and then also of PIPA, the red line version.
Well, I'm sure.
I think we cut out.
I'm sure. I'm
But
sure
it
you
was
did.
it was something.
But you were probably running around with the DNS technologists at that point, right?
No, but no, not the people who wrote the report. It was the entrepreneurs who
And the VCs.
and VCs.
And they were carrying that issue?
Absolutely.
That is really
And-
interesting.
And it was the issue that got a
The
lot
most
more
traction.
of the traction
And,
than
Yes.
most of the other issues because it was something that the phrase that
To break the internet.
pro-SOPA people hate, which is to break the internet, that people were talking about. that.
Right, and if we get to it, we've got a great slide
So-
on that message. That's really interesting because it didn't
That didn't come up.
completely, I mean,
It was definitely
I mean,
being
that
discussed
lobbying
Right.
that
much
day,
earlier, yes.
the VCs going around, but how much they were carrying this issue.
DNS was definitely one of the key issues, and
I-
it was the one that was getting.
I know
a
it's
lot of
Right,
traction.
hold on. But I actually think that the issue is, it was not the top line issue. And as we went through, it was probably the fifth issue. But tactically, as people went around and realized it was the one that got traction, it got picked up, and that really happened after the markup. This is the story that emerges. So again,
Yeah,
Right.
again, my recollection is totally different, that it was a concern from the very beginning, that it was
I mean,
pushed from the very beginning, it was,
Yeah.
that it was
the
a
technology
priority.
report was
Yeah.
like in May, right? I mean, it was
Yeah.
much earlier.
Yes.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
it took,
yeah.
but it took a
Yeah.
while to get that report and to find
Sure,
the
Yes.
people
right, and
away,
it was,
so it was
the
in
people
process
were-
way
because-
before that.
Yeah.
Exactly, because back during QUICA, there were people talking about the DNS.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
well, and there was an EFF report
Right.
back
Yes,
then.
and there was an ENF
Yeah.
report, and you were writing about it. I don't think we're saying that it hadn't been identified as an important issue. I think what we're saying is that inside Congress, about what they felt like they had to, this one shouldn't have a private right of action, maybe we can do the private right of action here. DNS for the Senate was immovable, and nobody had told the Senate that
That it
was
had
a
to come out.
bottom line, and with all the other issues that you wanted to negotiate. And I'm talking about when it got to a negotiating stage.
Right, not talking
My
points,
recollection-
but
That was for Wyden, that was,
Well, we're not talking about
We're not
Wyden.
talking about Wyden.
We're
no,
talking
but
outside
in
groups.
terms of when he, what he was communicating to people, what it would take to get him to lift the hold, I think
I know.
that dealing with that was,
I know.
for Wyden, absolutely. But
Yeah.
from our, and again, this is from our interviews.
These are interviews with
Right.
very informed people inside.
Both those receiving the requests and that for the tech sector, the DNS issue was not in their top 4 requests. That it was far lower down, and dealing with some in the tech sector were like, we can live with this, and I'm going to talk about why in a second. But it was lower down than doing away with the private right of action or dealing with other
The other
issues.
thing too is that I know that at least that the pro-SOPA side tried very, very hard to recruit people on the other side for the DNS
Yes.
thing. And there
Yes.
were conversations about, finding someone who actually understood what DNS was.
Yes.
To come out and say
Right.
SOPA, which they never were actually able to do, but they
or
tried.
another way of saying it is that there were so many things wrong with the bill that,
Right.
okay, maybe it wasn't in the top 4, but it was certainly in the top 10.
Right.
And that's, pretty, given how awful the bill was,
Right.
that's pretty
But by
high.
the time it had gotten to House markup, all of the effort, and including this report from very, very prominent DNS people, hadn't moved anybody. Or we didn't think it had moved anybody.
Right. So here, right, we have this issue, we have a report by people who are technical experts. It doesn't get any traction, basically, right? Proponents refute the report, they find some technologists who will say that this is
Not really.
from within the companies predominantly.
But not really. I mean, just
yeah.
kind of.
They don't, yeah, okay. Well, and there's no venue to actually have a conversation, so at some
There's no
level,
hearing, right?
it's a he said, she said, right? That's the way the debate plays out. There's no trusted source, right, for Congress to look to. So this is in part, we used to have the Office of Technology Assessment, it no longer exists. Congress, they get this report, they're a little suspicious of it because the technologists have been working with civil society, so they think, well, that this is being ginned up, right, concern. There's no real provenance, they're not really like, why should we care about how do we know these are the right experts, right? So there's a lot of kind of doubt about the importance of the report, and then in the background you have the silence of the ISPs on DNS blocking or the impact on DNSSEC, and they're like, well, if it's really a problem, why are the people who are going to have to deal with this, who actually run the infrastructure, why aren't they complaining? If it's really a problem, why should we believe you, right? So there's
And it was also one of the other problems was GoDaddy.
yes,
Remember GoDaddy, which is, the registrar, they said no problem. I mean, they were very
Yes.
much on the record for their own business
Yeah.
reasons.
yep, no problem.
And they said no problem with this.
SOPA was a revolt.
Yes.
Right, but that was also, I mean, so just completely, and the other thing you have to understand, it's like, who the hell understands what any of this stuff,
Yeah,
right?
that's-
I mean,
that's
over
the problem,
The
right?
internet is, even now, it's all magic, right?
Yep.
And no one in Congress has even the slightest idea. I mean, I don't have the slightest idea how this thing works. And so they certainly don't. And so it's
You're
all
not
mumbo.
supposed to say that out
All
loud.
mumbo. It's all mumbo jumbo, and so you have these experts, those experts. If as long as you have a couple of companies who say no problem, they say fine, no
Well,
problem.
and then there's the one thing, and I don't know if this is in your report or not, which is the Comcast. This was in January. Comcast. There was a blog post, and this is where you sort of mentioned that some of the engineers within some of the companies disagreed with the management. So Comcast, which owns NBC Universal and is supposedly supportive of SOPA, puts out a blog post that to this day, I assume that management of Comcast didn't realize what their VP of engineering was about to post, and said, we have implemented DNSSEC, and because of that, site blocking is no longer feasible. And basically, NBC Universal admitting that SOPA is a technical infeasibility, was really kind of a big deal, and I still am surprised that guy still works for.
So, well,
Comcast,
I think the fact that he does suggests that maybe there was more going on than meets the eye.
Yeah,
So,
Within that
a
company.
few things happen, right? So one, the private right of action changes the ISP's perspective on this DNS blocking issue. But for all of these reasons, it's kind of hard for them to change their public position. And so there is definitely some backroom communication that's happening. And I think one can look at that particular communication as a particular other sort of communication, perhaps. But most importantly, only when prominent Republicans start harping on the DNS issue does anybody really care about it. And so this happens in two ways. One is Stu Baker, who Leslie mentioned earlier. Stu is considered as a lawyer who knows a lot about the internet. He's worked on lots of internet issues. But more importantly, he's viewed as a hawk on national security. Right? He was general counsel at the NSA. He was general counsel at DHS. He's viewed as somebody who, if you are on, any committee in Congress that deals with security in any way, if he comes out saying this is a problem, you listen, and even if you're not like, oh, I'm going to oppose the bill, you're like, whoa, what are we doing over there? I'm a little worried about what that Judiciary Committee is doing, right? And so this was a very important signal to other Republicans, as is the fact that Heritage comes out with a report, and I'm going to talk about both of these later, but it really is, we have all this tech expertise. Civil society, I think, is in many ways filling a gap in congressional knowledge. As you said, they don't know enough about the internet. We don't expect them to be experts on every technical issue. We don't expect them to be experts on brain surgery, right? But we do expect that they're going to have some way to get expertise.
Right, but also Congress doesn't regulate brain surgery.
True.
I mean, there's
yes.
a good reason why it doesn't.
They regulate lots of aspects. Yes, at some level, right?
Some level.
But what we have here is the fact that technical expertise wasn't enough, that it had to have some level of partisan gloss on it for it to get traction.
Just so I'm not confused, civil society is lowercase, not an uppercase thing?
I mean, is it a name or is it a?
No, it's a group.
It's the group. It's the groups that.
Public knowledge, EFF.
It's the advocacy groups that do
public interest.
The public
If it's the public interest internet advocacy groups.
Yeah, it's not a group. It's
No,
not
yes.
okay,
Right.
right. Who basically make this their number one issue. They have technologists, they
Civil
have relationships.
society is used probably more internationally,
I
and
think
here
it's
we
also a
would use
restaurant, too.
advocacy organizations. Anyway, okay, so I want to move over to the White House and talk a little bit about what was going on at the White House. They had multiple concerns from the beginning, in particular around the DNS issue. It raised serious concerns in the NSC and in the security agencies, DHS, NSA, NIST. And one of the things that's interesting is while the technologist report didn't have a kind of ready audience in Congress to the extent that you might like, it did have a ready audience in these other federal agencies and in the White House. Congress has been gutted of its technical expertise. Over the past, self-gutted, yes.
Fish takes
Thank you
its
very
own
much.
Right.
But the White House, over the past 8 years or so, has actually buttressed its technical capacity. And so we had both an IP czar, we have Howard Schmidt, right, dealing with cybersecurity. We have Danny Weitzner dealing with internet policy. These are people who have pretty sophisticated expertise around internet policy. The White House had just helped chaperone through a set of internet policy-making principles, which basically were designed to get an international kind of norm of not using the internet architecture to do these sorts of things, right? So they'd just gone through this whole process of saying, hey, we should all collectively agree not to do this. And so the White House began an internal policy process. This was a very heated process. Their content went in, the tech sector went in, some of civil society went in. Civil society played a very important role in connecting the technologists to the White House. I believe VCs might have gone in as well, right? That there was a process at the White House that tried to get everybody in. And there was a lot of dialogue with the relevant agencies that are concerned about security and national security. And the technologists ended up being incredibly important even within the White House process in that they were viewed as neutral on the IP issue in a way that most of the other constituents were not, right? So this aspect of like whether or not you think protecting copyright is good or freedom of expression is good or fair use is good, we don't want to break the internet, right? And this technical piece ended up being very important in the White House deliberation. There were really mixed views of informants on the White House motivation, and Leslie didn't touch on this so much. We're going to talk about it a little bit more on the Republican strategy, but she'll chime in too. Why did the White House decide to get involved? Why did they come out with a joint blog post by 3 different people? Particularly given that most of the insiders thought the bill was dead already by the time that post came out, right? Why would the White House use their chits to make this statement, given that it's going to piss some people off, right? They could have just been quiet. So
right, I suppose the one fact is they have a strong IP czar, and most of the people on the political side of the White House are very tied to Hollywood. So you've basically got the National Economic Council and the National Security Council in having 2 different camps that have to be brought together.
So Jonathan has to leave, so I'm going to let him spend the next 2 or 3 minutes telling us what else we should think about before he leaves. And then I'm going to pick up Ann.
Well, no, I mean, I think just as I said before, I mean, there's, you know, and even just sort of sitting here, not only is my mind sort of exploding, partly because of all the things that I may have misremembered. And it really does go back to the D-Day analogy, but also, you know, that I've you know, as someone who's very involved, I mean, there's a lot more that I learned about what was going on. You know, that it is, you know, an enormously complicated story. I mean, at some level it is an unusual story as IP legislation goes, in 2 respects. One is because it really got into this whole technical thing that then brought in all kinds of other players that normally wouldn't be involved, as opposed to sort of straight.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that that will certainly have long-term implications. Sort of like, wait a minute, do we, you know, the whole problem of regulating technology and when you don't really understand what you're doing. That's part of it, and then the other piece that is sort of unprecedented is really the blackout and that level of public engagement. You know, so I've been working on copyright policy since you know, really since the early 90s, and this was the only time that you had this degree of public engagement. And you know, that's the question as to whether, you know, what is the long-term implication. I'm sure that's one of the things we'll be talking about, looking at is you know, is it really a one-time thing? Will it happen again? Can it happen again? And you know, at some point people's memory will fade, and you know, then what happens? So again, I'm sorry that I need to run, but.
Well, go off and think about, could DMCA ever happen again, and then we'll talk.
So this is my absolute favorite quote, which was not from an interview participant, but it was from a colleague, and I said, you know, this SOPA event was really interesting. And he was like, well, it was about copyright policy. Of course the public was really engaged. I thought you would appreciate that. I know. I was like, well, who knew? I guess I should have. I've been working on this a long time. You know, why did the White House get involved? They saw Republicans benefiting from this kerfuffle, right? There was a question about the whether or not they were going to peel off the tech sector for fundraising. The White House had expertise and understood the risk to security, right? That it was just straight up, this was all substance. They saw which way the wind was blowing, and they wanted to be on the right side. Some thought that they misunderstood what was in the bill. And views on the impact of the White House weighing in, it freed Democrats to oppose cloture and suspension, which people viewed as very important to the ongoing death of the bill, even if the bill was dead, keeping it dead. And it meant that SOPA was no longer viewed as viable in its current form, and probably the DNS issue in particular. So the last thing I want to talk about is the Republicans and the road to heritage. You guys now are familiar with the color coding, and so you can see general Republican opposition due to regulation viewed as very important by insider opponents, a little less important by insider proponents, even less important by outsider opponents. Heritage viewed as you know, more important by insider opponents, and again, same sort of breakdown. The Republicans' concern about enforcement, private right of action, and the DOJ issue, that was actually viewed as more important. And I think the reason this shows up as more important for insider proponents is it's a slightly more sophisticated read on the Republican basis for opposition. Not because they don't believe that the first one, general Republican opposition due to regulation, was important. It's that they were very focused on this issue, the fact that they didn't want to give Holder more power, the fact that they were really concerned about DOJ. And then finally, the opposition by conservative grassroots. It's interesting that the insider opponents view that as far more important. And I think in part there's a different level of understanding about the importance of people actually making real phone calls and showing up in members' offices on district visits. And I think that the insider opponents knew the importance of it and knew the extent to where it was happening, where insider proponents would know it was important but actually weren't aware of the extent to which it was happening.
Right. Let me just quickly add to that, which
Yeah.
is there was, and you'll go into that a little bit more, but if you were an insider and an opponent, you were aware of all of these different elements of the Republican strategy. And I guess Deirdre's going to go through those elements. So you knew from early on all of these pieces. If you were an outsider, you knew that it was really important to go to Republican offices, but probably didn't really understand that if you could create a certain level of controversy among Republicans, they would never get this bill to the floor. And so, you know, it's like the piece where if you're inside, you know all this useless arcane information that is only useful at a moment like that. And yes.
So
Could you expand on why, I think if I'm understanding correctly, SOPA would have given, the Republicans thought SOPA would give the DOJ too much power?
Yeah, they hated Holder because the way that they were going to get, you know, the search and the ISPs and the registers and everybody else to take down these quote infringing sites was that Justice Department would go and get court orders. So they were, you know, the bill expanded so that anybody with a copyright or a trademark or a, you know, or could
do it themselves.
Could do it themselves. You know, it was kind of roll your own. But
initially, it was DOJ was going to get the authority to remove content.
and
right?
so, you know, DOJ gets to remove content down to its like.
Turns out the Republicans have some content out there.
Yes. Right.
They've got a little content, and this is the Fast and Furious investigations going on. They're trying to make Holder the enemy. The Tea Party is, I'm probably talking down your slide. The Tea Party Republicans are very, very hostile to government, and you know somebody said that we've gone from conservative Republicans seeing the government as the important law enforcement arm of the state, for the country to, you know, basically the big brother states. So,
Would they have been happier if private entities?
no, and that's what's so interesting, because they
No.
also have a very strong
They
view
did like
about,
the private right of action.
because they have
At all,
very
yeah.
strong views against private
And there
rights
was-
of action, because that's med mal and all,
Yeah.
medical
There was also
malpractice.
the idea that this was a gift to Hollywood, and Hollywood's not known
Yes,
for
right.
supporting Republicans.
Yes.
And so let
yes,
me
on the
talk,
crassus.
just
So go
going
ahead and go
through
down.
what we, right, so, one question was, right, was Heritage an out of the blue aberration? Heritage has never taken a position in opposition to a copyright or IP bill in known history, right?
And have actively supported
Yes.
previous
Some.
IP bills.
Right.
Not all, but some,
But
yes.
some, yes.
And so, you know, was this a result of a savvy strategy, or did they, you know, have some, you know, epiphany? Like, what happened, right? And so, you know, there's Republican bloggers and organizations, there was some early warning outside of DC that the Republican base, more associated with the Tea Party, the red state sort of bloggers, were concerned about both the private right of action and the DNS issue, and particularly giving more power to justice. There's an emerging intellectual divide among Republicans on IP as a property right and the extent to which that's in tension, in particular in this bill, with their desire to have less regulation. That this was a bill that combined, you know, regulation and IP in a way that for them was really untenable. The Tea Party members have no historical commitment to IP, period. And they are hostile to Hollywood. And the fact that this was a big gift for Hollywood energized them in a way that perhaps other parts of the Republican base would not have been energized. Some parts of the Republican Party viewed this as an opportunity to align Republicans with tech, that tech has money to spend. They have not been huge contributors, but they have a lot of money, and this was an opportunity to peel them off from the Democrats and to solidify them as a fundraising base. The NET coalition executes a Republican strategy that's beyond the Judiciary Committee that was aimed at conservative Republicans.
So that is the Tech Industry Coalition, for those of you who are,
Yeah.
which
Google's part of it.
large part of it.
Large part of it, but so are other members of the tech sector. The tech advocacy groups are directing grassroots to focus on Republicans, even not just the red states, but telling demand progress, right? Focus on the Republicans. Don't waste your time focusing on Democrats. That's not where the action is. The security Republicans take up the DNS issue, right? And that becomes very important as a signaling. So when Heritage comes out in opposition, this is viewed as very important for one particular reason. The timing of all of this is around when we're looking at the Republican primaries. And there are many folks who feel that this is one exposure that they don't need. If you remember during the Republican debates, they all came out and said they were opposed to SOPA, right? That
Whatever it
this was
was,
viewed as a wide open flank. And so the Heritage position on this might not have mattered so much, but for the fact that this was in January, right? If it had happened later, the story might have been different. Okay. I'm going to let Richmond pick up. Do you want me to flick through?
Yeah, sure. So just quick couple things. Oh, that's loud. About the message of breaking the internet. So 59% of the interviewees thought that this was an important factor in the debate, and a lot of times in the dominant narrative, break the internet, I mean, everyone kind of acknowledges it as this really great piece of political rhetoric, but a lot of times it's presented as this kind of monolithic idea that the SOPA opponents use. This is like, the bill is going to break the internet. And when you look through the interviews and some of the other data we have, it's really interesting to see that people are using the same phrase in very different ways. So we started off talking about very early on, it gets this technical meaning associated with the security community, with the DNS issues, that this is going to technically break the underpinnings of the internet in a very kind of engineering sense. And so for a lot of the technically inclined and a lot of people insider opponents are using it in this way. But then when it moves into kind of the outsider opponents, it gains this censorship and free speech meaning. And while some people do kind of connect the DNS to the censorship and free speech, there's also a lot of people who don't do that and just talk about it in pure kind of, this is going to censor the web, it's going to cause all these free speech problems. And then some people kind of build on that and move on to economic and innovation causes that, like, it's going to kill YouTube, it's going to kill these other internet startups, it's going to,
breaking the internet.
right, and it's breaking the internet in that sense, it's breaking internet economics and innovation. And so it's also perceived differently based on, you know, what audience you're in, if you're for or against the bill. So again, most people think that it's really good political messaging, though there's debate. Some people think that it's been good to draw in people more, to learn more about the details about the debate. Others think it's just really an oversimplification to galvanize kind of grassroots action. Some see it as a strategic way to connect to the grassroots. And Nancy Pelosi's office in November after the hearing uses the hashtag Don't Break the Internet to kind of join into the grassroots effort at that point really early on. Others think that it's, you know, really hyper rhetoric. And then there's also this idea that it's kind of this message from people who know things about the internet to people in the legislature who don't know things about the internet, like speaking to a child saying, don't touch that, you're going to break it. Don't break the internet. And so, I mean, on one hand, the fact that this resonates so much with the kind of general public signifies how tightly woven the internet is into people's lives, which I think was an underappreciated fact in some circles at the outset of this. And the different meanings also allow a variety of groups to enter the coalition opposing SOPA for different reasons. So now that it's not just a technical issue, but it's also framed as something that has to do with human rights or general public access to the internet or access to resources, then it allows all these kind of human rights groups and other new entrants into this debate.
So the last thing we wanted to talk about was downstream impacts. As you saw, right, at least from the perspective of insiders, 81% of them, the blackout didn't kill the bill. Other things did. Yet it may have other downstream impacts, and we were talking to the interviewees about what the downstream impacts were of the overall kind of SOPA explosion. You're like, well, what do you think is going to happen? And there's a whole list here, right? Opponents will try to repeat. The coalition is really important, and it's going to remain active. Copyright is, the concerns over copyright is going to migrate to other issues, and people are going to be afraid to do anything on the internet, right? Congress is going to view it as a third rail. Copyright will be a third rail. Everyone's going to pay more attention to social media, to the extent that social media was really important in grassroots activity and in getting people to actually show up. Right? There were Congress people who were really impressed by the number of people who showed up in their office, and like, we have to pay more attention to social media because we can't just be listening to what we're hearing from people inside the Beltway. Questions about where copyright policy would move, and some people viewed it, copyright policy was going to move to trade negotiations, others said it's going to move to private ordering rather than legislative solutions because people are going to be afraid of the policy process. This gives you some perspective on how those broke down. And some of the more interesting ones, so you'll see down at the bottom, the insider proponents said, look, this just means we're going to move to private ordering, right? That's going to be the downstream impact. If the policy process is so broken that it can't function, then we're going to have to be moving to private ordering. Right above that, you'll see the outsiders against said, oh, the controversies are all going to move to trade negotiations, and that's in part because, as Mike noted, ACTA was already starting to heat up, right? And so they saw that some of the things, and there's a history in the DMCA debates of this kind of policy laundering, right? Things that you can't get here coming back through international agreements and then informing policy. So there's some different perspectives. General agreement that tech companies would be more engaged politically, and I think the formation of the birth of, after the NET coalition, the birth of the Internet Association is at least one suggestion. My understanding is that there's also been kind of greater ongoing connection in fundraising as well. Opponents felt that they would try to repeat the movement, right? So that the coalition that had been built, this interesting anti-SOPA coalition, would stay intact and would try to repeat that. And we've seen some of that in trade agreements. There's been some activity that signals that.
CISPA.
CISPA.
Except the technologists were mostly on the other side.
Right, and not all successful, and I think there's already some suggestion of how hard it is to get all those pieces to line up. Outside opponents said social media will be a bigger voice, controversies are going to shift to trade negotiations, and that social media can be really effective there, right? That we can get people in the streets. We know how to do that.
In Italy.
In Italy, right. Well, no,
Well, there's ACTA, which is
ACTA,
different.
No,
yes.
ACTA was one.
I know,
Yeah.
I'm teasing.
And proponents, they said, look, Congress isn't going to act on internet policy, and right, so that's going to push people to private ordering.
Which has big implications that.
Yeah, I'm not gonna.
Maybe not so great.
I pretty much went through these. So,
Yeah.
given the time, I'm gonna stop there. We have many additional things that we're looking at that we'd love to talk about, but I wanted to turn it over to Mike to add any other commentary, and then open it up to more questions or feedback from the audience. Thank you, guys. I know this was really long, and this is like this much of what we have.
Yeah, I'll just keep it short. No, I mean, I think it's interesting and sort of, reliving it a few years later and trying to remember what I was thinking at the time. But it reminded me of some stuff, and then, but also like Jonathan, I mean, I think I learned some stuff that I wasn't aware of as well. So it's really interesting. And I think, one of the things that I've noticed since then is that every time there's like anything sort of internet related, right? There's like, you have this reaction where people are like, well, we'll just, SOPA it, and for good and for bad, right? And there was like the good side of that, which is like getting people engaged and getting people who otherwise wouldn't be engaged in the policy issue has potential to be really good and really important. But at the same time, it's like the SOPA situation was kind of a one-time deal, and if you expect that you need that same level of reaction every time that you want to get, the internet involved in things, it's an impossible standard to live up to.
Right.
And so then, like, with CISPA, like suddenly, like people are like, oh, well, it was a one-time thing, or you have different things where you don't have that same reaction. And so I think it's interesting to try and learn the lessons, but I still wonder, like, was this so much of a unique circumstance that there isn't necessarily that many lessons that can then be useful going forward?
And one comment that came out from pro and anti-SOPA people, they said, look, anybody who views this as a success is like missing the whole point. Like, you can't expect to throw a temper tantrum as like, right, like this is not, like this is your worst case scenario, and everybody shouldn't be saying, can we repeat it? People should be saying, how do we get a policy process that makes sure we never get to that level of brinksmanship?
But part of the problem is now you also do have people from DC saying, oh, we'll see something and say, like, can we do it now? Let's SOPA that, right?
Yeah.
And where it's not even, it's not so much the people who were part of the coalition who did all this stuff saying, like, let's do that again. And most of the people sort of moved on, right? I mean, they're still paying attention and everything, but it's the DC, the
Really?
Policymakers who
Yeah.
are then saying, like,
Policymakers.
who are saying, it may very well
SOPA
be.
nostalgia.
But I've heard it much more from people like on Capitol Hill than anywhere else, where it's like, well,
Yeah.
all we have to do is SOPA this.
That's really fascinating. I think from our perspective, and sort of our particular biggest interest is what a failure this is as tech policy. And so what really has to change? Tech policy is now going to be embedded in everything.
Mm-hmm.
And this is kind of, I think, emblematic of how, obviously IP has its special flavor, which is, never question anything that the IP community tells you, but it's going to be everywhere, right? And they are not prepared to deal with it, and often they're not willing to deal with it. So I think that's one of our sort of first laser focus. Hopefully there's something that comes out of this that might inform how we move forward. And we never got to talk about Goodlat versus
Yeah.
read the book. No, we're not. We'll talk.
But there are some more summary things up here for you to kind of think about to the extent you want more to think about. It's a wider group of actors. Yeah.
How do we get this live?
We will give you the slides.
Mike Nelson,
Yeah.
Cloud Player.
Hi, Mike.
Great panel, except that I had to be on another panel.
Mm-hmm.
You may have already mentioned
we need to
You
hear
gotta
your
take a
voice.
position.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
We
that
didn't.
was question one. Question two was we can talk about the wonderful YouTube mashups, like the downfall.
Yeah.
PIPA.
We don't know anything about the internet.
Because my comment
We-
here, I had to talk about the HIPAA.
Yeah.
Millions of people watch, and
Yeah.
it's led to all sorts of
Right.
takedown moves.
Yeah.
So we didn't talk so much now about sort of all the wonderful, amazing things that went on online because it's been very well documented. I think what we were trying to do was, what are the other pieces? How are they
How do they
interrelated?
interact?
How did they further collaborate? So there is this. Did you come in after the White House slide?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, no, actually, I came in.
Yeah.
So it should be up on there, but we did not talk
It
about
should include, yeah,
it. Totally
because,
should.
because the We the
Your
People
question
was
didn't
the.
ask people about the social media impact.
Oh, no, we did, and there's certainly stuff in there about the We the People petition. It actually doesn't come up as a
Precipitate.
important factor. The White House does, but not the petition per se.
I think the petition
But it was
important for
forcing.
giving the avenue for the White House.
Right.
to-
I mean,
Absolutely.
that's what it's important, because obviously, an administration usually doesn't talk about a bill like in midstream when it's not even outside of the committee. So they did know that they, given their commitment to responding to these petitions, but it's really interesting. It's not clear to me in the White House interviews that we're gonna have to go back, you know,
I don't know that anybody said, but for that, we would not have come out with a position,
because they were.
but it is mentioned.
Yes,
But
it did seem like that was just sort of the convenient avenue, because, I mean, like, the White House has ignored an awful lot of We the People petitions that
Right.
have passed the
And they've
threshold.
come out on,
So,
and it's not completely unheard for them to come out and say something about a bill, right?
Right.
So,
It's just
I
early.
know when I was in the White House, first option was always,
Don't say
anything.
anything.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, they did spend a year watching it carefully
Before
before they really started moving in on it.
So the one thing that I was gonna say that feels like it's missing, and maybe.
No,
and
we're
we
looking for
we mentioned
missing.
it very briefly,
Mhm.
so like the GoDaddy protest
yeah.
was actually a really big deal in terms of galvanizing a lot more people in terms of, you know, I don't know what people know, but like, because GoDaddy came out in support of the bill, and then all these people organized a day to move your domains away from GoDaddy
Right.
and to protest them, and it apparently had, you know, enough of an impact that GoDaddy walked away and,
Right.
and started apologizing profusely in sort of a weird way, but that actually got more companies to realize, like, taking a stand in favor of SOPA is
Right.
a dangerous thing for our business.
So
And
one of
that
the
was a big
things that came out this morning, it came out in one interview, but it came out this morning when we did this presentation, is the extent to which, if you go all the way back to, no, I won't do that. If you go all the way back to one of my early slides, about who we interviewed, and I said this blank box, this outsider proponents, is empty. And there was some suggestion that the reason that box is empty is that the GoDaddy protests scared all of the small businesses in a way that even if they wanted to support it, they would never ever say anything
Well, there was
because
also,
they
I mean,
couldn't.
because, you know, the GoDaddy was on a list, and there were two separate lists of companies that supported SOPA,
Right.
and one of the lists was you know, complete bullshit, basically. I mean, they sort of took all these companies or law firms that had, you know, said, like, we need new copyright
Right.
law, but didn't specifically endorse
Right.
the bill, and they were on that list, and they were sort of, you know, I think someone in one of the hearings sort of listed them out, and then all of them started to come out really quickly and say, no, we didn't support that bill, and so you had all these people walking away from it. So I wonder, if you could find those people now who are more willing to actually admit that they're
I don't know.
briefly supporting.
Yeah.
I mean, Microsoft briefly supported SOPA, right?
Sort of,
Yeah.
sort of. I mean, the truth is, even in the Senate, when it came out, it was hard to exactly know where Microsoft was.
Sure.
They were sort of counting Microsoft as a supporter, because they wanted to have, as I think I said at the beginning, they wanted to be able to name some people in every sector, but there was not a lot of evidence of it.
Sure.
So, yeah, I have a story about GoDaddy to tell you, but not now. Maybe when we walk out.
And my founder, our student,
Oh, thank you, Mike.
Do you want to say something about what you think the effect on the act, the resistance and actor was as the aftermath? Because although many of us, including me, didn't foresee reuse of the blackout choice, we also seen Occupy happen that fall, and we saw the success of the
Right.
very important Italian Wikipedia blackout. And then, but then in the run up to ACTA was seen as a done deal.
Yeah.
It was
And
definitely
it
seen as,
actually kind of was.
It was a done
Was a
deal.
done deal,
They
yeah.
pushed it, they just never signed it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, my own view, as I was watching some slides from various places, different activists in other countries, was that ACTA protesters felt really empowered
Absolutely.
by the effectiveness of whatever the process was that stopped SOPA and PIPA, and it actually energized them into the spring
oh, absolutely.
of 2012.
That's certainly what our interviews say. There's not a lot of data points on it,
There's
though.
not, I mean, we don't have a lot of data points. James Losey wrote an interesting piece about ACTA, which when I look at it, makes me feel like he did this similar research to what we did here, because he really shows how what the on-the-ground groups had been doing for the year and a half before, and
Translated
how,
it.
and how it all came about. In fact,
Yeah, because that, I mean, the protests against ACTA, like, shot into overdrive right after.
right after.
Yeah.
So I think there's no doubt
Yeah.
that, of the
There's a
influence,
connection.
that there's a connection. But
But I don't think we have, since we weren't focused on ACTA, people viewed this as this coalition would stay together and would be active. And as I said, the same groups that were saying it would stay together and social media and online activism would be important, we're also talking about free trade agreements as like the next place where it was going to flare up.
Policy level.
because of, yeah, right, Mike.
Mike Nelson again. This is kind of an odd question, but I'm a futurist. I look forward 5 years or so. We are still hearing people talk about SOPA
Yeah.
at most moments, in opposition to CCP.
Mhm.
They're saying, well, if you look closely, SOPA is embedded in that crazy thing. Did you get a sense from talking to people whether they were optimistic or pessimistic, depending on how you look at it, about the trends and whether in 5 years we will have substantially stronger copyright enforcement built into the infrastructure of the internet?
I don't think so. I think if anybody saw trends, it was, those who wanted
More
to be,
cautious.
that everybody was gonna be more cautious about IP
But
at
that
all.
to the extent that those deals were going to happen, they were going to be in private ordering.
Right.
They were going to be the six strikes or throttled sort of things. They were not going to be happening in Congress.
Which of course,
Private ordering.
so private ordering means when all the companies from both sides get together and.
Well, and
you know,
sometimes
sometimes
multi-stakeholder
it's a
efforts.
So
multi-stakeholder
the
effort.
sort of example that came out of this was the Six Strikes Agreement, which is that like the major ISPs have agreed to this, program with the entertainment companies to send notices, and that was just a private agreement that was brokered quietly by the White House, but was not
Right.
legislation. It was just this agreement.
It's actually not six strikes, nobody gets kicked off, but that's what.
No judiciary, no,
But there's no,
no Justice Department involvement, no
Right.
court involvement.
it's like corporate
Right.
pseudo law, so they make an agreement, so there's sort of escalating notices.
And there are all sorts of issues with
Right.
that, and all sorts of reasons
But
to be
it's
concerned about
but it's
that.
definitely not as bad as SOPA.
But the trend
Right.
overseas is
But the,
step by step.
Yeah.
right,
Things are happening
All-
often invisibly in
Right.
trade agreements.
And I mean, there's a big human rights question because, some things it's fine for people to go off in a room and do, but when you're touching on rights and there's no process, at some point it sort of moves outside of the realm where private parties ought to be striking these
yeah, but
agreements.
the point that he's making too is that there has been legislation passed
Yeah.
elsewhere, and then the trade agreements sort of try and bring those back.
Bring it back.
here.
Absolutely,
And
try to
that's
bring it back
absolutely
here.
And there's a lot of very creative high-priced lawyers who are finding new modes of attack.
Right.
Cloudflare, a security
Yes.
firm, a web hosting firm, you can't kick people off the internet. And we got caught up in a copyright action where the lawyers for the content agreement used trademark law.
Right.
Right.
So these battles are ongoing, and I think one thing that is happening is that they're moving to new venues. And in looking at any of those venues, they, for the most part, right, we have a lot of questions about procedural and substantive legitimacy, right? And is it transparent? Who's involved? Who's setting the policy? What sort of due process is involved? And most of them don't look like the sort of process that you would get out of a court, or you would, right? And so all of those concerns, as we see policy making shift, because Congress has become unwilling, right? You will see Congress members say, I don't want to be SOPA'd. I don't want to deal with it. If it touches on the internet, I'm not really that interested in touching it. And to the extent that's so, and there's policy making that needs to happen, it's going to find a venue. And thinking about how the venue selection choices influence the capacity for different sorts of participants to have a voice is a pretty significant question.
On that note, can we hear it for our wonderful knowledgeable
Yeah.
speakers?
Because we're really